Welcome to Risk Engineers Talk Governance. In this episode, due diligence engineers Richard Robinson and Gaye Francis wrap up a few topics they've discussed throughout Season 2 and chat about de-engineering in organisations and engineering philosophy. Please enjoy the chat, and if you do, give us a rating. Also, don't forget to subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. If you have any feedback or topic ideas, get in touch via admin@r2a.com.au and look out for Season 3.
Hi Richard, welcome to our last podcast for Season 2.
Welcome, Gaye.
Today, we're not really sure what we're going to talk about. There's a few topics that we've sort of touched on in the podcast throughout this season, and there's been some comments about de-engineering and engineering education, engineering philosophy. So we'd sort of thought we'd make this a little bit of a mismatch.
Well, and I think the core reason why it sort of popped up was when we were at the VCAT hearing acting as an expert witness, the member actually asked the Major Hazards Facility and the council to sort of provide some information, and the regulator, Major Hazards Regulator, ought to provide information.
Some technical information.
Technical information. And what we sort of discovered was they all sent lawyers. There were no technical engineering type knowledge people there at all.
Just clarifying that they weren't in the session, but our understanding was that the facility, the major hazard facility, had gone back to their technical people to confirm the understanding, but they were not represented as such at the hearings.
And likewise with the major hazard regulator, the actual technical people giving the technical advice weren't there. They were being represented and interpreted by lawyers.
Correct.
Now, this sort of reflects, and when it actually came down to the final hearing, and in fact, I was the only technical expert witness there, which surprised me greatly because I would have thought the council, for example, would have thought to have their own technical expert witness, and that was not the case. They were actually represented by a lawyer and a
Town planner.
A town planner
Who were both consultants to the council.
Who were both consultants to the council. And
I think the other one was that they actually commented and said it during the hearing, we don't have that technical expertise.
Correct. And so
on a technical matter, which was a bit of a
which was the
shock.
whole point of the exercise. And obviously, you know, the town planner and the lawyer's knowledge of town planning, legal and past cases and all that sort of thing is obviously something which we had very little knowledge about and chose not to comment on at all.
Yes.
But when it actually came to the technical matters, overpressures and how these things would happen and what sort of controls you could put in engineering design and safety design and all these other matters, it simply wasn't considered so far as we could tell from their point of view. Now, when you stand back and look at this is something that's been happening in local government for some time, and we've noticed this all over the place. I mean, once upon a time you used to have the town clerk who did the administration and a municipal or city engineer who ran the outside things. But that means they also did planning permits, building permits and everything. These days that's all been disaggregated, and so now you have the building permits basically run by building surveyors and the planning permits run by town planners, and you have no holistic overview of what can be done or how things could be done to manage things. And so when some curious recommendation from our point of view pops out to say the way to manage risk from an explosion over pressure is just to reduce the number of people that live there rather than building a building so it can withstand and prevent the hazards from actually causing pain and suffering to people, that just wasn't contemplated so far as we could tell. Now, this is something which has been popping up all over the place because it actually has higher level consequences for your society. What seems to happen in local government, at least, is that all the engineers are basically being pushed into water and wastewater and sewage and stormwater, but they've all been pushed into silos. There's no overarching engineering philosophy put in. Now, you might ask the question, what's engineering philosophy? Because I do have to report that as a group, engineers really haven't been that interested in the subject. I tend to mention it every now and then to you, and you sort of roll your eyes at me, to be fair.
Rich has been trying to write a engineering philosophy book and course for, I've been working with him for over 20 years, and I think he's been trying to do it in all of that time since I've been working with him.
Well, yes, and I keep trying different universities, trying to get them interested, and to say they're not particularly interested in me, but that's the way universities have gone, if you don't have a PhD these days, you really don't get much of a look into any of these courses, as we have discovered.
Yes.
It doesn't matter how intellectually useful what you're saying is, so far as we can tell.
Yeah, it's an academic qualification.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess in that sense, there used to be a fair transfer between industry and tertiary education and engineers. I haven't seen that occurring as much as it used to. I can quite distinctly remember I was at Monash as a student doing engineering. They actually appointed a professor who's definitely outside was definitely industry based, and they did that as a matter of policy, as I recall correctly. Whether that's still happening or not, I get the feeling it's not. I think academia has become very cloistered, let's put it that way. Anyway, the point about all this, though, is you see what's engineering and what's engineering philosophy and what's engineering education about. Now, this is something I've had a bit to do about. I mean, a long time ago, before we sort of started the risk engineering, well, it was the loss control section of the management branch of Victoria Division, which turned into the Risk Engineering Society. But we're also doing things, running engineering education programs for engineers, CPD basically for engineers. And we got a lot of very interesting speakers, and I think that's when I talked to Bernard Callan to give me a help on a couple of things too, because he was interested in the subject as well. But I also dug out some papers by Sir John Monash. He gave a very interesting paper on engineering education in his retiring address as the Victoria Institute President of the Victoria Institute of Engineers. And he was explaining how the need for engineers to have a sort of a global view on what was going on. And this was before he basically went off to the First World War and became a very successful general, because again he had a very global view of how things should be thought about. Now, from my point of view, engineering philosophy has always been the philosophy of change, meaning if you don't like it, change it. And one of the characteristics of engineers, and I know I've talked to a number of spouses of engineers, and one of the things they always observe about them is said, well, you know, when something they don't think's quite right, they go and fix it. They go and do something about it. That's one of the characteristics that they've always observed.
I think it's a curiosity and ability to question things. If you don't just take it as the status quo.
But that's one of the problems we've been having with engineering education, because we've been running some postgrad programs for different universities at different times. And one of the things we've noticed is that some of these graduate engineers we've been getting haven't been as curious or wanting to change as much. They just want whatever the information is so they can go and apply it. And it's want to be a cookbook recipe. And if you like, that's one of the frustrations we have with the whole ABLAR business. From our point of view, there's a process. You use quantified risk assessment, use a target level of risk. If you don't satisfy your criteria, then you do something, rather than sort of saying, is there something else that needs to be done?
I think that's being extended more into industry as well. You know, a number of clients that we talk to and potential clients that we talk to, what's the answer? What's the process to get the answer? And risk's one of those subjects that it's not a cookie cutter approach. It's not black and white. You will get subtly different answers to every problem you apply it to.
Correct.
And so you've got to think. And thinking is hard. We touched on this in another podcast. And we found that people want a process. What's the process that I need to do to get the answer? And I don't know whether it's because it's gone down a more compliance or an audit type process. Black and white, it's right or wrong. But in risk, it's not right or wrong. It's about thinking it through and putting in the best option that you can.
Well, I think that's the point. Remember how we obviously promoted the Professor of Public Policy and Law from Cambridge University, David Howarth. And the point he made was, and this is where the big law firms in the UK and US have gone to, and that it's law is engineering. And what he meant by that, and they're literally following the engineering design process, a client turns up, they've got a problem or they want to do something. In the circumstances, what are the options? Well, what are the options? And in the circumstances, which is the best? That's a straight out engineering design option. It's not a cookie cutter approach in the sense of, here's a process we'll go through and we'll definitely get you the best answer, because you don't know what the options are until you look for them. And then we don't know what your circumstances are. And so what might actually be the best thing to do at that time, and it can change.
Yes.
But that's the best advice you're going to get. Now, that is what the consulting engineers used to do. But they've stopped calling themselves consulting engineers, have turned into Consult Australia. I don't quite understand what that is.
Right.
And they've dropped their code of ethics. I mean, for those of you who don't remember these things, I do, but because I used to talk to Ben Fink, the Managing Director of GHD, he was very strong on this. To be a member of the ACA, the consulting engineers, the majority ownership had to be engineers who were corporate members of Engineers Australia, and the reason for that was to ensure that the Code of Ethics of Engineers Australia was the consulting engineering practice had to comply with the Code of Ethics of Engineers Australia, which basically said you had to put the interest of your client first. Once you just become owned by general shareholders, it's all about the money for the shareholders. Nobody cares about the ethics. If to pull the plug on the job is the commercially intelligent thing to do for your shareholders, then you do that. Whereas from a consulting engineering viewpoint, you have to finish the job in the best interest of your client, even if it meant you might lose some money. And you can only do that if the majority of the directors are actually bound by a code of ethics. And then the question becomes, what's a profession? Well, generally, it's applying a code of ethics. And if you can't apply a code of ethics, then what are you?
But I think that has dropped down even in Engineers Australia. The code of ethics is not as promoted as it once was.
Well, Ben Fink made it absolutely crystal clear to me. He said there was 3, although I think there's actually 5. Stick to your area of competence, no kickbacks, he who pays you is your client, be responsible for your own negligence, and give credit where credit's due. And wow, has that one been gone missing lately?
Yes, and that was instilled in Richard, and being Richard's business partner, that had been instilled in me from a very, very young age as a young engineer. I think what we're also seeing, and maybe this is the reason why people are looking for more that cookie cutter approach and those systems and processes in place, is the idea that organisations are being de-engineered. We're coming across a lot of people in engineering roles or technical roles that don't have a technical background.
Correct.
And so they're looking for processes and systems to put in place to be able to understand, but they don't have the background to be able to question. Is that the right idea?
That's one way of saying it.
Of those in technical organisations. So we've come across quite a lot of people that are running big technical projects that don't have any technical background.
And you can be done if you have the right technical advice, but that means you're going to have the right people working with you.
So it's about that team approach again. You can't do these things in isolation.
I suppose there's 2 other points I'll just make in passing. There was this thing, I think it was the University of Wollongong actually who started it, and then the medical faculties took it over. But one of the things they sort of said was, one of our frustrations, certainly I had when I was doing engineering, was that you were taught all this science, basically, and you had basically made an applied scientist in effect. And all the ethics stuff and all the legal stuff that you need to know to be effectively in practice, you learnt after you'd got a qualification of some sort. And I'd just been pumped science at you and you didn't really understand what use it was going to be. And I've got to say, an awful lot of it wasn't of a great use, the way my career went, was never made sense to me. Now, the University of Wollongong, I think it was, decided that what they would do first was the first thing they'd ever give a bunch of engineers in first year, the first thing you got was a design exercise. And you found out what you needed to know in order to make it work. And then you worked out, well, if I need to know this, I'd better go and study that. And that's what the medical faculty started doing. They take a bunch of first-year students and show them some poor soul in a bed who's not well, and they say, what's wrong with them?
What are you
and
going to
force them to understand what they needed to know in order to bring about a successful conclusion. I understand the medical, that's one of the reasons why I started education branch in Victoria, because we were trying to expand that sort of understanding into the local universities. I don't think it actually succeeded. Although every now and then, sometimes you see a spark of life in a different place you weren't expecting. But this overall philosophical view, it does seem to me to be important, still is. And the other way I think it might have popped up, if you start the engineering society as a whole, one of the consequences of trying to fix that is to start registering engineers. I'm not sure I would have preferred to be the other way around, that the engineering philosophy was still endemic in society and the engineers weren't registered. But if the only way to actually get the engineering philosophy back into the system is to register them and force it back into the system that way, then that might be a necessary consequence, but I'm still not absolutely sure about whether that's going to work.
But that's not what they're using registration for engineers for. It's a liability.
But it has that consequence. Whether or not that's what was intended,
True.
And certainly the way the engineers have been going about it, it's more about being a status thing rather than a functional thing, whereas I'm more interested functionally. But it's like us. We don't find that being registered in Queensland or Victoria is essential to us because from the point of view of signing off on the design, which is where the crunch really comes, we can't do that anyway. And by the time we've finished doing our due diligence approach, everybody's got to have agreed that it's a good idea, and then the individual design flows from that.
Yes, yeah. So I think taking all of this and wrapping up our last podcast for the season, it's really about engineering is about that philosophy of change and being able to change things. And to be able to change things, you got to think.
Well, Karl Popper, in his book of Objective Knowledge, I think it is, he makes the point, he gives an example of a mechanical engineer. He said, look, when you're designing a society, no mechanical engineer would design a car without testing it hard and running it through all sorts of things. You don't just get the design, get it right the first time and everything works, right? You work hard to make it function. Musk just got his rocket off again. They both blew up, but the separation that got into space, it really is a progressive evolutionary design, and I suspect the next one will actually get there. This stuff takes time, and it's hard work. Societal change and issues require the same effort. And for the life of me, I've never understood how that understanding, which sort of exists in philosophy generally, isn't understood to apply in engineering philosophical terms too. But that's just me, obviously. Not everybody frets about this stuff.
All right. So I think on that note, we might finish our podcast for today, Richard. Thank you for joining us for Season 2. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we will be back for Season 3 very soon.
Thanks, Gaye.
Thanks, Richard.